Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. I am your host, Karim Sirajuddin. Today we have a very profound show. Sister Zara Faris joins me today. She is currently working on her first book called Women's Rights Without Feminism. She is a graduate in Arabic and Islamic Studies from SOAS University, which stands for School of Oriental and African Studies. She's also lived a year in Egypt to study Arabic. She is now a researcher, author, and international speaker for the Muslim Debate Initiative. She has done some really interesting work. She's had a few TV and radio appearances, including Islam Channel and BBC Radio. She's debated feminism with the former Green Party leader Natalie Bennett, journalist Julie Bindel, academic Ziba Mir-Hosseini, and Marina Mahathir, daughter of the former Malaysian Prime Minister. She also had debated the House believes Sharia is fairer than English law with an English law judge and QC, and Zara and her colleague won the motion on vote change. Today's show is a real powerful primer, especially for me, on just learning more about what is going on in the landscape of feminism and Muslim women. And I've been following her work for a bit now, and so I was really excited to finally get her on the show and share her knowledge. And I just let her, school me basically and educate me, and it was great. She did share a lot of fascinating insights, and I plan to have her on again this year, inshallah. Definitely, if you'd like to submit some questions, check out patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. Become a patron today so that you can submit questions to Sister Zara Faris in the future. I'm also going to be scheduled for speaking again with Dr. Muhammad Ghilan. He was the neuroscientist on the episode Yin and Yang. We are scheduled as well for this year, bi'idhnillah, as well as Dr. Shadi El-Masri, an imam in New Jersey, who also has the Safina podcast. Check that out if you have the chance. So just to ask questions to guests like these and more to come, go to the link patreon.com/coffeewithkareem in this show. It's also linked in every single show. You'll find it in the description. Click on that today and join our community and start getting more involved. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. Help support this show. Thanks again for tuning in to the Coffee with Kareem podcast. I have today Sister Zara Faris calling in from the UK. Sister Zara, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
So I'd love to hear more about this book, Women's Rights Without Feminism. Now, obviously, we live in interesting times, as every century would say. But this particular era that we're in, at least I've noticed in my lifetime, there's been a lot of shifts and deconstruction, if you will, of what it means to have genders, to have sexuality, to have rights. And, I almost get the sense sometimes that some people I know or interact with, they almost feel like this fatigue around all this feminism these days. It's like, all right, how much more do we have to be criticized or scrutinized or put down? And now clearly feminism didn't come out of a vacuum. There are some, important intentions or objectives to the cause, but it also seems like it's, I don't know, I feel like it's almost becoming very messy. Like I almost don't know, I want to, of course, as a Muslim believer, I want to support equality and equity between human beings and certainly men and women. I don't feel like Islam goes against any of that, but then at the same time, you just get this whole spectrum of what it means to be a feminist, and if you're not, then you're in some other camp. So I'd love to hear more about why you chose this title, Women's Rights Without Feminism, because for many that would sound kind of, counterintuitive or against logic, so to speak. So why don't you tell us more about that?
Sure. So that phenomenon of that questioning that aren't these two the same thing is exactly what I want to question and what I want to put out there, which is the fact that we should be asking this question. And the reason for this is because essentially feminism is one approach to the matter of women's rights, but it is just one. So another way of putting it, for example, is it is what capitalism or communism, for example, are to economics. So economics is about, the distribution of resources. And capitalism and communism each have their own ideologies, their own worldviews, their own origin stories. And, they also didn't arise out of a vacuum. They have their own bases for resource distribution. Similarly, feminism has been one approach to the matter of women's rights, and Islam provides a completely different one. And I feel like from what I have observed, a lot of the angst that is generated over this issue is when we do see them as synonymous, when we see feminism and Islam as being the same thing. They have different cores, CORES. They have different core beliefs or different core establishments or different drivers behind them. So by way of one example, and just to also caveat this, when we talk about feminism and, if we point out any flaws or anything like this, or we criticize it or critique it, this is not to deny the fact that, we are in dire need of rehabilitation as a community. We are in dire need of reviving, the wisdoms and the practices of Islam in our community. Very often, the lack of implementation of women's rights, whether it's in, Muslim communities living in Western countries or whether it's in the Muslim world, and it happens, it's often a glaring piece of evidence, that society overall isn't functioning according to Islamic principles. Is in fact a symptom of, a much deeper problem. Because if all of those functions and the infrastructure and the balance was there, a lot of the injustices that we are experiencing wouldn't occur. So it is very much a holistic issue. It's broader than just, in a vacuum that only women's rights are being denied. But the difference, one of the primary differences between feminism's historically and present day approach to the matter of women's rights and Islam's approach is that feminism tends to be based on the dogma of individualism. So the idea that each human being is, in a sense, nothing more than an individual. And the primary purpose is to exist as an individual. And the primary purpose of the way that you live is to maximize your autonomy to do, what you want to do. Conversely, and obviously we know that humans aren't merely individuals. Humans on every level are desperate for social interaction. I don't mean desperate in a pitiful sense. I mean desperate in a very primal and necessary sense.
Right. We're social mammals.
And we're defined to some extent by society, by culture, by parents, by genetics, the languages that we're taught. If we think about the fact that no human being can even learn language without depending on another human being, we are inherently dependent on one another. So, for example, solitary confinement, therefore, is one of the most inhumane punishments that, people can conceive. Now, given the fact that, we are not, merely individuals like cells in the body, Islam's approach is different. So it's not about maximizing the autonomy for the individual. And often doing that, maximizing that autonomy or giving the individual almost the delusion that, liberation means liberating oneself from all of these influences is actually really misleading. It's not possible to do that. And it ends up orphaning us from our higher purpose. And often we end up therefore vulnerable to, oppression by those who happen to be stronger in society at the time. On the other hand, we find that, Islam, and the term liberate is again questionable, but it does liberate us from this sort of enslavement to causality, because it gives us, the creator is the one to whom, we must, maximize our autonomy to serve, right? I mean, that is what, for being a Muslim, it gives us a purpose that, that is higher than that, focusing on just the self.
Right. So if I'm understanding you correctly, just so I can summarize here,
Yeah.
Islam obviously has its own philosophical paradigm, if you will, that launches us into many approaches or different ways of handling the human condition. And feminism, as you described, is also an approach, but it's generated by individuals, and sometimes it's too individual centric, if you will, and that can cause more harm than good, because as you're describing here, humans are social creatures. I've always said this, we can't live under this illusion that, oh, I'm an independent man or woman or whatever. In reality, as you said, we're all completely dependent and interconnected to everything else around us, right? There is no such thing as absolute independence. This is an illusion. And so already you have, if you have an Islamic paradigm or a feminist paradigm or capitalist paradigm, whatever school of thought you're working through, there's already going to be a different way of defining our terms, of developing practical solutions and values based on the philosophical paradigm that we're working with. And so if feminism is coming from a place that isn't originated in what we would consider a higher divine source, then already there can be some concerns there. Is that kind of what you're trying to exemplify here?
Right, that's exactly it. And I guess simply speaking, you could say that feminism is an ideology that I suppose makes the female individual, rather than the male individual, the arbiter in working out what is good and what is, and what is good for women. In Islam, on the other hand, we make God the arbiter, and the individual is merely the agent in that. And those are the two different paradigms. And and I suppose this goes back to your original question, a lot of the angst arises when we imagine that those two are the same. And, it's like looking through one lens and then applying a solution through a different lens entirely. It's going to be incoherent, and it's going to result in a lot of the, I suppose, the incoherent outcomes that we are experiencing.
So there's a pretty broad spectrum here, at least from my observations of this phenomena and how the Muslim community has been interacting with it. Maybe it's safe to say, there's almost like three camps. There's the camp that's saying, hey, let's revive and return to the Islamic tradition as it is. Part of the problem we have, and I've witnessed this, of course, there's oppressive realities towards men and women in some Muslim families, and certain notions that are embedded in our cultures. And there is, of course, always this distance between what does the message of Islam really say and then what is being expressed through a political, cultural structure that we happen to be a part of, even though it might be a Muslim one, right? So you have, of course, the first camp of kind of reconciling all of this is, well, this is really about us finding our own answers within our tradition. And part of the reason why we think there isn't answers or solutions is because we're ignorant ourselves of our own tradition. And this is an important obligation on any sincere believer to seek that knowledge within the tradition and be able to reconcile some of these, hard problems of modernity and gender, if you will. On the other hand, you have people that say, no, let's actually change the religious tradition to fit whatever zeitgeist, constructs of the time we are very comfortable with or we really like. And this, of course, can result in changing the narrative of our religion. And then, of course, there are the people who would say, maybe the third camp of, okay, let's keep Islam as it is, but we have to, quote unquote, reform it, which could also include kind of some editing or coming up with new ways of interpreting constructs or, principles in Islam that has really never been done before in the last 1400 years. Would you say that's a fair assessment of perhaps the three reactionary there to the phenomena of political feminism, at least in the Western Muslim world? What are your thoughts?
Right. I mean, there are definitely different camps, just as there are in Western secular feminism. And I suppose the first one that I would flag, even before those who speak about, and maybe this is the same as those who call for Islamic revival, there are those who occasionally innocently use the term, feminist or feminism. And again, just imagining that it merely means women's rights and it doesn't have, the colonial and political baggage that it really carries. But there are those who may use the term knowing that it has a social currency. So, using the term feminism in the States or in the UK, and knowing that it garners support from outside of the community, often against their community. And, the reality is it doesn't really get the job done anyway. So within that set of categories, it might be helpful also for me to just mention whether, it's actually effective or not. So I suppose with the first camp, those who call for Islamic revival and may innocently use the term, Islamic feminism, thinking that they are simply drawing attention to a particular area that needs to have our attention. Unfortunately, using the term doesn't really get the job done. It ends up putting people off. So, for example, we have issues where Muslim women want, more access to the masajid, to the mosques, rightfully so, because, Islamically this cannot be prohibited. As the Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, do not prevent the women from going to the masajid. And, it's up to them whether they go or not. So for some sisters, driving this cause under the banner of feminism ends up backfiring. Whereas they had just wanted to revive the prophetic model and did this under the language of Islam and using the labels of Islam and defining the act of prohibiting women as being, something that was, not what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam allowed, which would garner much more understanding and much more support. Unfortunately, using the term feminism and the language of feminism, like terms like misogyny, which are so loaded and require a lot of time to understand what this really means, it ends up putting people off and getting their backs up. So even in that first camp where it's used innocently, unfortunately, it has that effect. And then you go on to the second camp, those who may want to change, certain aspects of the tradition. And it's actually, there is a strong overlap perhaps between that and the third camp that you mentioned, which is where they want to redefine what Islam is, to reform it altogether. And again, now so in the first camp, the word feminism was being used for currency, right? Now in the second aspect, the word Islam is used for social currency. So you have those who may, there are so many academics and writers, Aisha Chowdhury, Amna Wadood, Fatima Mernissi, Leila Ahmed, the list is endless, Keisha Ali, go on and on and on, of those who under the title Islamic feminism will claim that, they're trying to revive Islam and understand what Islam really was in the first place, according to them. But in actual fact, they will readily admit that their projects are not about doing that. And when we look at their text, they will readily, state directly that their work is about reconciling and, combining, contemporary ethics or secular beliefs with Islam. And so in that sense, the term Islamic feminism, is then being used to garner social currency amongst Muslims. So under the guise of the term Islam, it's, sort of a backdoor to reformation. So this term feminism, for this reason, is best avoided altogether.
Let me ask you this, Sister Zara, because I wanted to ask you, why don't you define for us feminism from your understanding? Like, what would be the most, generic definition or academic historical definition that you can think of? And then you're more than welcome to kind of categorize, these different camps as you've observed. I was just offering that as a way for us to kind of work with. But if you feel there's other categories that have different nuances, feel free to kind of identify that for us and then start walking us through, the pros and cons perhaps of each paradigm.
Sure. Like. Well, with I say Western feminism because, that is where the term originated. The term feminism originated in the West. It has so many camps, so many iterations and so many divisions. And one of the, well-known facts about it is that feminists themselves don't really agree on what feminism means. But I suppose the most generic definition that is often used, and it's one that nobody could really disagree with, is it's the movement for the equal rights of men and women. And nobody is going to disagree with that because it's the most, generic statement, almost a platitude. That sentiment, nobody would disagree with that. But beyond the very broad notion of, quote unquote, not oppressing women, there's very little in common that, Islam and feminism would have in their approach to dealing with that. But, throughout the ages, there have been, several different waves of feminism. And to some extent, this has been defined by the broader political landscape. So, the first wave was all about, in the West, was all about, gaining legal rights. For example, the right to vote, the right to have property, these sorts of things. The second wave was more about, equality in the workplace. So. And to some extent, a little bit of that is still ongoing. The right to have the same jobs and the same sort of pay as men, and there's all sorts of issues involved there. And then the third wave is I suppose defined more by postmodern thinking. And this is where we end up in the very messy terrain of, what does gender mean? What does sexuality? What does sex mean? What are all these different aspects? How do they transpire? And now we are in a sort of a quagmire of it's like it's even more confused now to understand than it has ever been before. And if at any time there has been a need for clarity, for the clarity that Islam provides on the issue, it is particularly now.
So do you find it's problematic to use the term Islamic feminist? Like, are you an Islamic feminist, Zara? Would you identify as a feminist? Why or why not?
I would not. And I think the funniest thing is that I have in the past, because I speak about women's rights and women's issues, on one or two occasions, people describe me as an Islamic feminist. And that's despite the fact that, a large part of my early work was purely critiquing feminism, which just shows how meaningless the term really is in its application. The other issue, and it has come back to me now, was on intersectional feminism. So I guess the current iteration of feminism is, this idea that a type of feminism that looks at issues of injustice by cutting across all possible causes. So it looks at class, it looks at race, it looks at age, it looks at all these sorts of different issues. But the problem with this is that it's effectively an admission that feminism alone is inadequate. It needs all these other, approaches to really understand, to diagnose what's going on in society. But even then, in its solutions, of which it doesn't have any agreed upon solutions. Again, because it doesn't have a text or a canon or a book to refer to, like with Islam that we do. With intersectional feminism, the most you could get out of it is, a slightly more nuanced approach to diagnosing what's wrong with society. But even then, it's based on so many, particular ideological presumptions that by the end of it, you still wouldn't have a clear idea of what to do about all sorts of situations, about the hypersexualization of women and men, about poverty, about all these environmental factors, about everything. It doesn't have the tools to actually provide a solution to those issues.
Right. Now, let me ask you this: what were some of the, in all of your debating and research and critiquing, what have you found have been the quote unquote hard problems that certain Muslim feminists have critiqued Islam about that you can think of, and what were your responses to some of those critiques to help us understand a bit more about the dialogue? And maybe you can also share 3 critiques that you've had of feminism and how you've just deconstructed certain notions that is found in this paradigm, and tell us more about the practical aspect of, why this even matters for us on a day-to-day, and as certainly a Muslim community interacting with all of this.
Sure. So I guess one of the main issues, rather than critiques, that comes out of discussing or debating whether Islam or feminism is, the correct approach to women's rights, is the fact that we don't actually have a present day model that we can point to show the way that Islam ought to be manifest in society. So, for example, we can speak all day about the Islamic, the God-given, not the man-given or the woman-given, or it wasn't human beings that thought of this, but the God-given right, for example, for a woman to manage her own economic affairs and be provided for. But at the end of the day, that depends on the duty that a male relative has to provide for her. But this ends up becoming a pipe dream in situations of poverty, which is manifest particularly in Muslim countries because of poverty or corruption. There are many cases of men and even young boys that are going out in very, perilous times to try to earn to provide for their families, to provide for their brothers and sisters. And in that situation, they're not trying to get money just to go off and, on their own sort of eat, pray, love adventure. They're trying to fulfill their rights towards their family. And so her right to be provided for Islamically depends on the economic situation in those societies. Another issue that comes out of this, the fact that we don't have a current example to point to, is, for example, the fact that, Muslim women have the God-given right to obtain legal remedies in the event, for example, of divorce or marital discord or any sort of issue, that she may face in terms of family law. But again, this depends on the duty of those who are in authority to manage people's affairs justly. And that, again, it becomes a pipe dream. It becomes impossible where there is the lack of an Islamic authority or courts to hear such complaints justly. And, again, this is a problem because we can't point to a current day example of this being practiced in the correct way. And I guess a third thing that comes out of this is, the right, the God-given right for men and women to seek knowledge within means, right? So, the woman's right to, for example, go out and seek knowledge if she's able to. It depends, again, on the duty of those who are more learned, to, convey what they have learned. But again, this becomes hazardous and impossible if, the streets are filled with violence or war, or people are too busy scraping together a living to have, any time to really enhance themselves in that way. So we can speak about all of these rights, but unfortunately, we don't have a present day example to point to. And what's really interesting, and not just in debates on feminism, but in debates on Sharia, more generally. So perhaps you mentioned one of my debates that I did with a colleague of mine a year or two ago on this house. The title, the motion was, "This House believes that Islamic law is more just than English law." And my colleague and myself, we were addressing an audience that was, sort of a very well-to-do older generation in the countryside in England. It was very sort of out in the sticks, and people there were very I guess, of a different time. They're of a previous generation, and we were expecting to, we weren't expecting to win this debate because of, the nature of the issue we were discussing. We were debating this against, an English law judge and a barrister, and we were expecting for this to be an opportunity to merely talk about what, to at least inform people of what Islam proposes and what it offers. And subhanAllah, the people were convinced to the extent that, on vote account, we actually won the debate. And the main subhanAllah, and the only contention that came, from this crowd was, why isn't there an example that we can point to today? Why is the Muslim world the way that it is today?
Sorry, but you're asking about like an example today, meaning like a nation, like a society, like there's no country we can point to and say, oh, there's the Islamic, worldview in a modern context. That's right, what you mean.
Exactly. And part of this is, and you hinted at this earlier when, you mentioned that, along the lines of the fact that, and what I mentioned, that we are in a state of rehabilitation, after a lot of, Muslim countries experiencing colonialism and effectively a very rich and sophisticated history of jurisprudence, of ijtihad, of legal reasoning, of development, of refinement, during and because of colonialism, cut to an end, to the point where our Islamic history ends up becoming something that we explore as archaeologists, rather than as active, dynamic legal thinkers. We are in a state where we are kind of searching for nuggets of how to live.
Mm-hmm. But Sister Zara, if I just threw that question back, right, like, and said, okay, point to me right now where there's an ideal Jewish nation, or Catholic nation, or Protestant nation, or Buddhist, or Hindu, or socialist, or whatever. Where are you going to point when it comes to all these other faiths or philosophies or worldviews? Like, I feel like Muslims are often put in this defensive place of, we have to have a perfect manifestation of our tradition or else we're always in the defensive. It's like, that's not, that same question, if I said, where is there a nation that, exemplifies all of the Judeo-Christian values, like from A to Z? Do you think that's even a fair place to even be put in, in the first place? Do you get my question?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the first thing to point out is that, Islam doesn't promise, a utopia by any means. But I don't think there is anyone that would describe any of the Muslim countries at the moment as representing, the way that Islam is supposed to be practiced overall. And I suppose, one of my colleagues put it very well when he said that Islam doesn't promise a utopia, but it promises an optopia. So it tries to calibrate these different aspects of society such that they are at, optimum performance, not perfection.
Right.
But I suppose the difference between, this question for Muslims and this question for perhaps a different religious group is that, Christianity, by way of one example, and even Judaism to some extent, they've had a different history in terms of their interaction, in particular with secularism. To the extent that, it was a challenge to secularize Christianity, but it was secularized. And so the manifestation of Christianity is accepted as a norm, as being different to, what it perhaps was, before that. For Islam, on the other hand, I suppose it's a harder nut to crack because for us, these things can't be separated. And so in order to understand or to visualize Islam, it's important to remember that, if you combine it, as for example, in Pakistan, by way of one example, Pakistan is not, it's a Muslim country, but, it's not an Islamic, legally an Islamic country because it has, it's mainly a secular system with a few aspects of Islam woven through, again, perhaps partly as, to some extent lip service. But, there is a big difference between, for example, a Muslim country that is based on Sharia and, and doing its best. And it may not be perfect, but it is, it's not meant to be. It's doing its optimum. And there's a difference between that and a secular country, which is what we have generally today, with where, Muslims happen to live. So I think it's a different question when we ask it of the Christian community or the Jewish community or, any others. It's a different question from what it is for Muslims, because for us, it is a holistic, practice. Islam it's spiritual. It's, it's everything.
You can't be a secular Muslim, basically, right? It's an oxymoron. Right. It doesn't work. So you can be a secular Christian or Jew, or at least it's evolved to that extent. I mean, I've met people that identify with, let's say, the cultural facets of the religion, but not the theological or existential. But you're saying for Muslims, or at least the the Muslims who perhaps understand the tradition, they see it as a very holistic thing, and you can't be a secular Muslim, right? It can't just be about the holidays necessarily, like it is with some other communities. Is that your point?
Well, yes, and the way to, I suppose, emphasize it is that Islam doesn't just have its own, its own political view. It has its own economic system. It has its own, in every aspect, it has a particular pattern. It has a balance between all of these things. And just like some of the examples that, that I mentioned, all of these things are interlinked. And if any of those aspects, if the economic aspect is out of whack, if, the justice system is out of whack, if any of those things are displaced or not as they should be, it leads to this discordance, and that is when we end up with issues and situations such as Muslim women's rights being denied. Right. Yeah, so hence it is this bigger picture, and I think this is part of the idea of it comes into this aspect of tawheed, this connection between things.
What I understood you say was, if the tradition is not practiced, whether on an individual or communitarian societal level, holistically, then the principles that are hijacked along the way or not implemented surely will cause a ripple effect and cause oppression and injustice in all the other spheres of the human experience, whether it's gender, socioeconomic, etc. That's what you're saying. That's why it's not as simple.
Exactly.
So this is kind of you helping us understand why it's not that simple to just address certain questions or hard problems about women in Islam if we don't understand the total system that we are working through, which is the Islamic tradition, right? And so it's not that simple to just go, well, the reason why women's inheritance is different from men is because that's the way it is, versus saying, if you have a total socioeconomic structure that is influenced and guided by Islamic principles, at least as optimized as possible, then it follows that you will have less oppression and injustice, perhaps.
Right, and I suppose it might be helpful to emphasize some of the details of how that would work. So, when it comes to inheritance, it's often thrown at us. And perhaps this is an example of something that, feminists bring up against Islam and that we often deal with. Inheritance is one, witness testimony is another, and perhaps we'll think of another one for a third. When it comes to inheritance, it's often asked, why do women receive less than their male counterparts? And it's interesting if you look at, first of all, if you look at the number of individuals that inherit upon, the death of a particular individual, there are more women in that list. By way of just, starting out, looking at this issue, there are more women in that list than there are men. So, mothers, sisters, aunts, daughters, etc., etc. Moreover, the women inherit first. They inherit before the men. And, they will tend to inherit those things which pertain to, the stability of lifestyle. So things like, the house, the car, things which, are needed for day-to-day life to continue, without harm, without impediment, that sort of thing. And what the men would tend to inherit is the fluid money, the cash, the liquid money. This is because of, one of the rights which, I mentioned earlier, which is that the women have the right to be provided for. And, the liquid funds is obviously the easiest way for men to do that. So the additional amount that the men receive, it's not, again, for them to go off on a jolly, but rather it's for them to provide for the women themselves. And one of the mistakes, and I suppose that is made, and this is perhaps a good example of looking at things through the wrong lens, is when we look at people and we value them in materialistic terms, we might be mistaken to think that Islam values women less because women get less inheritance. But of course, we don't value women or men by monetary amounts at all. But rather, this is more to do with the practicalities of how these resources are distributed in society. The amount that someone would receive is not necessarily, or it's not at all what they're worth, but rather it's just about the administration of those funds. It's about the administration of those resources. And what's interesting is because of this advantage, the fact that women, have the right to be provided for, historically, women have had a certain amount of disposable income. So if a woman wants to provide for her family, for example, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but for any of your listeners who are new to the issue, if a woman wants to provide for her family, she gets more reward than her husband would, because it's not her job to do so. And again, because
it's not an obligation, it's a potential, but it's never an obligation. That's
right. And not only that, but with this additional income, this disposable income, historically, women, for example, in the during the Ottoman Caliphate, women actually of all classes, so not just the upper class, but working class, middle class, upper class, women constituted about 30% of those who would donate and fund public amenities like fountains, baths, schools, soup kitchens, etc. And so it gives them that ability. So again, it's about channeling these resources in a way that benefits not just one person or two people or a family, but gives people the ability, it facilitates them to, maximize the good that they can do in society overall. And so, yeah, I mean, we're often asked this question about inheritance as though, I'm going to ask you this and it's going to really expose you. But actually, the Islamic explanation, the hikmah, the wisdom behind it is actually so beautiful, and it makes sense in this broader context.
Absolutely. Because as you said, just to highlight the keys here, number one, according to Islamic law, men are under the obligation of providing for their families. Women are not in the same way. And so men are expected to distribute that wealth in a different fashion than women distributing their wealth, because women can keep their wealth to themselves if they want, but they also have that freedom to contribute to society or their family in ways that they want. And I'm hearing you say that if we didn't have that channel of distributing wealth through the female, maybe that's part of what helped our societies have that aestheticism, these other practical functions like wells or fountains, as you mentioned in the Ottoman note here. And so, again, it's about kind of stepping back and seeing the holistic, harmonious societal structure of how male and female will manifest different roles and powers with equity, bi'idhnillah.
Right, exactly. And, it's not just, it's not to straitjacket women. So this is, I suppose, another contention that comes in from the feminist perspective that, Islam just wants women to, quote unquote, just be mothers. Well, first of all, Islam I suppose the contention is, why do women have to value themselves in relation to men in Islam? And, the first thing we will point out is that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually addressed men and said, the best of you are those who are best to their women. So in Islam, even men are valued according to how they treat their women. So, we're not in this, men and women are essentially, as the Quran states, allies to one another. And our service is for the sake of the Creator. We're not servants to one another, but we serve, one another for the Creator. And so, this issue of, a lot of these discussions tend to be very, focused on the individual and focused on, what rights can one person get, again, to maximize that individual autonomy. But because we are intertwined in our needs, in our, in everything, we see that, Islam views people in this way, that they are dependent on one another. And, it structures all sorts of aspects in society along those lines. Bismillah. So one of the other critiques that we often hear, either in these debates or just generally, is the idea that, Islam considers women to be lesser because, according to them, for every single male witness, we need 2 female witnesses. And of course, this is a supreme simplification and decontextualization of what's really going on. There are cases in Islam where you would need, for example, 4 men for every 1 woman, or 2 men for every 1 woman. So there is one, So for example, there is the one scenario where, and again, this relates to, the economic sort of infrastructure of society, because women were not obligated to be involved commercially. Because they didn't have that as an obligation, it was considered unfair to expect women to be conversant or to be familiar with commercial or economic affairs. And so only in issues of, commercial and economic affairs, it was considered fair and, a mercy that to sort of encourage the use of male witnesses. From my understanding. So for every 1 male witness, you either had another male witness or you had 2 female witnesses. And this was because, women were not, even if they were involved in the commercial and industrial fields, they weren't expected to be. So it was considered unfair to expect them to give testimony on such issues. And so it allowed them to have, a backup, to have someone to give testimony along with you.
Right, like supplemental support.
Right, exactly. And similarly, if it was a case where it was more, testimony was required, but the issue was more to do with issues to do with the women's domain, then you would need 2 male witnesses. You would need more male witnesses, and you would only need 1 female witness.
SubhanAllah. So it was reversed in other contexts based on the familiarity or exposure to that particular subject matter that we're bearing witness to.
Right. And another thing to note is that, it's different in the case of, for example, a marital dispute. In a marital dispute, if the husband gives testimony against his wife and she gives testimony that counteracts his, they cancel one another out. It's not merely because he's a man that his testimony takes precedence.
Like specifically the fornication one, right? For instance.
Right. So that's actually a different example, because in that you would need 4 male witnesses, right? If you think about it, for against every 1 female witness. But even in a simple marital dispute, husband and wife, they would cancel one another out. So it's not just because it's not to do with the gender, but rather it's to do with the particular issue. And the domain that it's involved. It's like an expert witness, who is more likely to have expertise on a certain issue. And So again, that's something that we can easily deal with in these discussions. But it's really about going to understanding what the wisdom is behind this, and part of that involves a bit of a historical exploration into the landscape of the time, how things worked now, and reviving the ability to explore these issues in relation to today's matters. And so, a lot of these, there are a lot of Islamic opinions, a lot of Islamic policies, a lot of, Islamic rulings that are, relevant for, situations that we still have today. But we also have some new questions, some new situations for which we require, further ijtihad by qualified individuals. And so that I guess I suppose leads us to one of the issues that we already discussed, about the tradition sort of being a little bit dormant at the moment, but requiring a bit of a jump start again.
Right. Now, how about when we now look towards feminism and some of the, let's say, central constructs or principles that you have found problematic or may actually end up taking away more than it gives back to society, right? Because we always want to think about how men and women will be functioning together, because as long as we're a human species, both of us are going to be around, right? So we really got to think about how it impacts everybody. And I know that in your work and your videos and articles, you tend to always try to make sure we see this bigger picture rather than focus on a particular pixel of the picture. Can you tell us more about some of the central ideas or constructs that may manifest through feminism in an unhealthy or perhaps harmful way?
Absolutely. So, another reason why this is important is because we can see some of the ill effects of, and which I'm going to talk about, but we can see some of the outcomes of this when we realize that there are now counter groups to feminism in Western society. So you have, for example, men's rights activists, and you have extremer versions of that, under the acronym MGTOW, MGTOW, men going the other way. And it's the phenomenon of men deciding that, they actually don't want anything to do with women. So whereas we understand that men and women need each other in order, for the human race to survive, there are some men who have decided that, to the extent possible, they don't want anything to do with women. And this is sort of, this pendulum swinging rather wildly, in Western society, and it thinks it's redressing some of the injustices, but actually what it's doing is it's just creating the same injustice, but in reverse. So I suppose, a few examples of this, the idea that people, and I suppose this ties in a little bit with what I was saying about feminism and women's rights not being synonymous. But similarly, feminism and justice are not synonymous either. So there is, I suppose, this idea, one of the core tenets of feminism, which is, the idea that women have traditionally been dehumanized by a male-dominated society. And, they would call this idea the patriarchy. So it's a term that many of us come across. And, essentially the idea of patriarchy as used by feminists is the almost conspiratorial idea that it's always been better to be a man. And it sort of snubs many of the privileges that, women have enjoyed simply for being women. And I suppose I spoke about some of these things, very early on in my work, and it might be helpful to mention a few of those again now. Often it's presumed that, men have had it better in society in terms of, legal, economic, everything. It just presumes that, and men have had it better at the expense of women. But actually, if we look at society at a really basic level, we can see that women have actually had an intrinsic worth instituted in society, regardless of what she does. And part of the reason for this, and it's been noted by, a lot of different, sociologists and different thinkers, is that because it only takes one man, and this is in terms of, survival of the human race, I suppose, it only takes one man for many women to have children. And because of this, it's given rise to the idea that men are largely disposable, whilst every woman is indispensable. And this is the idea of the quote unquote disposable male. It's quite a complex idea generally, and it leads to questions of why we send men readily off into war, why we prepare them from a young age to be willing to do that, to sacrifice themselves. But with women, we prioritize the safety and comfort. And for example, why women are rescued first in the lifeboat scenario, and why women are generally protected from roles such as being firefighters or coal miners or these sorts of dangerous jobs. And the point of bringing this up is merely so that we can actually question the narrative, so that we can question the premises that often feminism brings to the table, and we don't really question it. Another example of this is the issue of domestic abuse and domestic violence. And it's something that we always imagine is only one-sided. We imagine that domestic violence is only about men being violent toward women. In reality, and people are learning this more and more and becoming more savvy to this, there are actually incredibly high rates of women also being violent towards their male partners. There are incredibly high rates of violence between same-sex couples, with alarming rates of violence, particularly in lesbian couples. So the idea of domestic violence, for example, being a feminist issue is a disservice to people who have experienced this and their perpetrator happened to not be male, because they are either not taken seriously or they are sidelined, they are made a mockery of. There are many examples of men, for example, who, their female partners, men generally have better physical strength, but that doesn't mean that women can't find ways to hurt them. So there's examples of women, for example, putting crushed up glass into their husband's food, or attacking them with blades and things like that. And because of this idea that domestic violence only happens to women at the hands of men, male victims are often, if they do call the police, they're more likely to be themselves arrested and taken away than receive sort of redress for some of the issues for the crimes against them. Now, this is not to say that it's not a numbers game. By any means. It's not the fact that, it happens more to one than the other, or it happens equally to both of them. The fact is there is a situation where there is serious discordances, there is the serious increase of violence, in the home, in the place that's supposed to be people's sanctuary. What is the reason for this? And why are we, movements like feminism hijacking these issues as if they are only things that men are doing to women? And the reason for that is to sort of underpin this idea of patriarchy, that women have always been hard done by at the hands of men. And the problem with this is that it doesn't lead us to a just outcome. What happens is that we end up applying solutions like feminists have done so, whereby one side eventually ends up embittered. The men are now embittered because they are now not being taken seriously, or they are now being, hard done by, and they're not being, they're not finding redress for their issues. So this pendulum is swinging, in the opposite direction now. And this is far from the balance that Islam Islam establishes a way for us to redress these issues without residual rancor, because it gives us a very precise model with which to do that. There are many other examples of that. But the second issue is that feminism itself, it doesn't have clear solutions, and it often evades many of the issues that we are facing. We mentioned this earlier. It exists in so many different factions. Conservative, liberal, socialist, postmodernism, postmodern, eco-feminist, intersectional feminist. They don't actually have a shared value system or a core moral guidance from which to draw. Perhaps the only thing, that they do have in common is the name, and they will happily contradict not just one another, but even themselves where they need to. So, there's one example where, a while ago, there was a feminist campaign on a very prominent UK feminist society's website, and it was recommended in a report by Baroness Corsten, who is, a leading legal figure here. And this campaign was to close the inequality gap between men and women by campaigning that female prisons should be closed down, not male prisons, but just female prisons, because they didn't suit women's needs. Now, just to interject here, from an Islamic perspective, Islam, from what we can see, doesn't advocate prisons for either men or women. This is why it has alternative forms of dealing with certain issues, because prison is seen as unjust in the sense that you deny an entire family of their family member because of something that person did. You deny them of their obligations towards society. So we don't see it as conducive to any person's needs, their biological or otherwise. But in this particular campaign, although feminists will often talk about the fact that women should not be judged by their biology, by their hormones, or by any of these things, they actually argued in this report that women's prisons should be closed, and they should be replaced with what effectively ends up being women's social clubs, where female offenders, during the day, they'll go to these centers, they'll spend time with each other. Part of that involves, quote unquote, organizing their own shopping budgets and cooking, which is something that every human being does anyway. It doesn't really sound like much of a punishment. And then at the end of the day, they get to go home to their children. But from their perspective, men didn't need to go home to their children. Their children apparently didn't need them. So the report, for example, I happen to have to hand, and one of the things that it said women and men are different. Equal treatment of men and women does not result in equal outcomes. And it went on to claim that women, and here's the real kicker in this, women are governed by hormones and a monthly cycle which affects their moods and emotions, and these biological factors have a direct bearing on the way in which women experience stressful events during their lives. Now, if a man were to say the same thing about treating women differently based on their hormones and monthly cycle, there would be absolute uproar. But here we see an example of, because feminists don't have a framework for understanding human nature and the human condition, they're happy to completely contradict themselves and say, okay, in this scenario, women are governed by these biological factors if it means obtaining these privileges. And I suppose one more example of that lack of clarity and that lack of having, that moral guidance and that shared system is with regards to, the hypersexualization of society. And this is not something that just women are experiencing, but we see it, we witness it more and more with men as well, where people are encouraged to value themselves based on how they look. There are many studies done where, young women in the UK and the US, school and teenage, early 20s, a lot of these women express sentiments like they didn't want to leave the house to go to school or to go to the doctor or to go to college or to go to whatever place they needed to go to based on how they looked, because they felt that they didn't look good enough for society. And there are others where a lot of these young women would and continue to believe genuinely that society would value them more based on how they look. So the better they look, the better society will value them. So this objectification of women and increasingly men, feminists don't know how to deal with this. So you have some groups that advocate androgenizing the female appearance. There are others who may campaign for, safer cosmetic surgery, but they won't actually challenge why women feel compelled to have that cosmetic surgery done in the first place. And there's all these different, voices about how to deal with something that, again, Islam has a very clear approach to this. So, according to Islam, no person should be, judged by their appearance. And this is why we try to minimize this sort of sexual tension and competitiveness in society by, for both men and women having, firstly, a formula for how we dress. And secondly, for having a particular formula for how we interact with each other. To the extent that it ends up being something that's a very professional interaction, in public life. And, from the perspective of feminism, it can't actually deal with these complexities. And particularly, when it advocates something like individualism and this sort of, this sexual freedom and empowerment, but at the same time, it's then dealing with the product of that. And the product of that is the hypersexualization of society. It is sort of the open and free market where men and women may approach each other, without hesitation, and often, unwanted or wanted, whatever it may be. A lot of this is a result of this empowerment and this, this individualistic, autonomy of sexuality that has been promoted by feminism. Then we are now dealing with the repercussions of it, and feminists are now having to backtrack and undo and readdress some of these issues. And so rather than getting into that game of trial and error, particularly for Muslims, where we have a very clear guideline of, and there's a hikmah, there's a wisdom behind all of the, the prescriptions that Islam provides on these issues. Sometimes we, particularly for younger Muslims, get into the sentiment or the mindset that Islam is merely prohibiting things for the sake of it, and it's never doing that. And it's only when we look at how these things play out in society that we see why Islam's approach, for example, to hijab or to division of labor or to all of these things, why it is the way that it is. And this is part of the rehabilitation that we need to do in amongst ourselves, about developing this collective awareness, developing this acceptance or this realization that Islam has a different, as you said, a different paradigm that we need to view the situation through.
No, I really appreciate that summary. I mean, as someone in the field of Islamic psychology, I mean, similarly, you have, the same kind of challenge or tension, right? You have a paradigm of psychology that's rooted in specific philosophical ideas about what it means to be human, what's healthy, what's unhealthy. And that doesn't always align with an Islamic worldview of what it means to be human and what's healthy. So similarly, I'm hearing you say that the paradigm has a lot to do with our conclusions, our mechanisms, and the values that we believe are true. And if we don't, as Muslims, rehabilitate or seek more of that knowledge, explore, as you said, then it's going to be very difficult for us to really understand why there are some of these premises in our religion, and whatever's happening in modern society may become a lot more appealing or convincing, perhaps.
We've had a sort of very preliminary discussion on the issue today. It's such a detailed discussion, and there's so many directions that we can look at this in. And I suppose this is sort of a primer on the discussion generally. Before the closing statement, I do want to add something about the idea that sometimes people get that Islam straitjackets women into a particular role, because we talked a little bit about the fact that women are not obligated to provide. So people do end up thinking that Islam asks women to only be, homemakers or mothers. And again, this is to do with the paradigm generally that we are looking at the issue through. From the perspective of Islam, women can take whatever role that they seek. They can be whatever. They can seek economic prosperity. They can become Islamic scholars. They can do whatever. The only thing that matters is for whose sake you are doing these things. The idea is that sometimes it is presumed that if someone is of a particular role, that they are inherently less or more than someone who is in another role. But Islam doesn't look at it in the sense of necessarily what you are doing alone, but the virtue and how well you execute your duty, how you discharge your duty. So, for example, a male ruler inherently doesn't have any more credit or value, than someone who is a mother. Rather, it's how we fulfill those responsibilities and how we fulfill those duties. And so that's just something that is important to flag, that in Islam, it's not, some women either, they can't have children or they don't want to. And Islam tries to accommodate for the general rule. It tries to accommodate for the fact that most women at some point in their lives will go through, becoming a mother and raising a family. And so a lot of the legal provisions, a lot of the social expectations are geared around that. But there are always exceptions to that. And there are always, women and even men who go, against the general rule, but the exceptions tend to resolve themselves, and they don't have intrinsically a lesser worth than anybody else. It's about what we do with whatever advantage we're given in society. And just to tie this into the earlier discussion that we had about inheritance, where men, for example, are given any advantage, or where women are given any advantage, they are given a greater accountability as well. So where men do receive more inheritance, they are going to be all the more accountable for what they do with that, not just here, in the eyes of a court, but also, in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They will be more accountable for any advantage that they have. In terms of advice that I would give for any Muslim women that might find themselves to be enamored by feminism today, in the sense that sometimes a lot of sisters, as we mentioned earlier, might gravitate towards the movement or the language or the sentiment because it is popular, because it has that social currency, because it may seem, appealing, or, it may seem, the thing to do, right? My advice would be that we should be promoting the language and the terms and the sentiments of being a Muslim instead, particularly in these times where being a Muslim is something that is often, darkened and criticized and seen as something, negative in society. We should be reclaiming, the terms and the language of Islam. And where something is wrong, where women's rights are being denied, rather than saying, as a feminist, X, Y, and Z, this is wrong, rather than saying that, it has more potency and more power for us to say and to call it out as un-Islamic. Because by doing so, we are immediately pointing, one, to our rubric that we are using, to the fact that we are using Islam as our lens, first of all. And secondly, we are pointing to the fact, not that it's wrong by any other standard, we are pointing to the fact that it's wrong by the standards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and nothing is worse than that. And we are also pointing to the fact that the solution that we want is, for Islam to be applied correctly. So I think it is far more powerful, and I think the people who we are appealing to, whether that is those who manage Islamic courts at the moment, whether it is the councils of the masajid, whether it is our male family relatives, or whether it is males in the community, it has much more currency if we simply use the language of the religion that they themselves have subscribed to. If we use the language of Islam, and in a way, this will enable us to be, haqqtivists, activists for the haqq, right? Rather than, merely, borrowing ideas and, getting people's backs up and driving them away. We essentially want to work with these men. We want these men and these women to work together. We want to reach this state of being allies of one another, but we're not going to do that if we are deliberately using language which is not well received and which has so much of this baggage, and which has very much, I dare to say, which has very much failed the West. Why are we then trying to adopt that into our own worldview?
SubhanAllah. Sister Zara Faris, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show, and this will be, inshallah, hopefully just a primer, and we will definitely have you on again soon to discuss more topics on women and Islam and feminism.
Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much for having me.
Karim Sirajuddin here. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit nurhuman.com to learn more about how I provide personal, spiritual, and relationship counsel. Please generously help sponsor this show to keep on going at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. That's patreon.com/coffeewithkareem.